verse number 30 some odd. We are dealing with the discussion, the things or the decision that's going to be made. And then we'll close this out looking at the contention that arose between Paul and Barnabas over John Mark and taking him again on the trip with them. So let's look at verse 22. I know we got here last Wednesday evening, but just catching us up, there were individuals that came from Jerusalem to Antioch, where Paul and Barnabas were following the first missionary tour. They came there and they taught repetitively that one who was a Gentile could come to Christ and be saved, but he had to be also what? Circumcised. So they were linking Judaism and part of the Mosaic law to the salvation of the Gentiles. When this was continually brought up, then it was decided by the church at Antioch that we're going to, all right, send Paul and Barnabas and a group of individuals to Jerusalem, and they're going to meet with the leaders, the elders, the apostles, members of the church at Jerusalem, and they're going to discuss this and going to decide this issue. Now, it wasn't as I stated last Wednesday night, they did not go to Jerusalem to determine what? They didn't go there to determine what? Okay. They didn't go there to determine doctrine. The doctrine was such that, no, the Gentiles did not have to become circumcised in order to be saved. But what they went there for was to discuss things so that they would all be where? One mind. They would all be on the same plane, same thought. And so now they come to Jerusalem, they meet, and so then the leaders at Jerusalem, they say, this isn't binding, that they have to be circumcised, it's not a part, so they send a letter, and they're now carrying this back to the church in Antioch. Now this is, the latter part of this is really just the recounting of the letter and the delivery, how it was accepted. And so it pleased the apostles, verse 22, the whole church, the apostles, elders, the whole church, to send chosen men of their own company to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, and two now are named. We have Judas, also called or named Barsabbas, and Silas, leading men among the brethren. So they sent Paul and Barnabas back, and they sent two leading individuals from the congregation in Jerusalem to go back. Now, this is much like Peter. When Peter was going to Cornelius, who did Peter take with him? 6 men. Why did he take those 6 men? Witnesses. Now, these leading men named Judas and Silas, they're going back, and so now we have Paul and Barnabas, and we have others that are in the company, but we have Barsabbas, we have Judas, I should say, and Silas, leading men who now, when they went back, when they got back to Antioch, and all of this is now going to be reported, now they had witnesses that these things had been decided. This is how we're going to implement this, because as we stated earlier, this is not determining doctrine. This is how are we going to carry this out in a practical manner. Okay? Because this, to us in the 21st century world we live in, this idea of circumcision and Jew-Gentile relationships, it seems like a very insignificant thing. But if we plugged ourselves into that first century world, it's not. It's not. So now he says we're going to send these men. Now, they wrote this letter, verse 23. the apostles, the elders, and the brethren. To the brethren who are of the Gentiles in Antioch, Syria, and Cilicia, greetings. Now, if you have a map in the back of your Bible, then it might be good to just kind of go back there and look, because this letter comes from Jerusalem. The men travel, they get to Antioch, and you go way up that coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. And I need to clarify this statement because it is 250 to 300 miles from Jerusalem to Antioch. So they travel, they get to Antioch, and they get there, and now they're going to address the brethren who are in Antioch, who are in Syria, and who are also in the area of Cilicia. Now, if you go on up that coastline and you get to Antioch, and then you see the coastline, it turns up, and you just go west, follow that coastline to the west, and you'll see Cilicia, and you'll see those areas that Paul is addressing. This is later going to become known to us as southern Galatia. And this is what is in the minds of most commentators, the audience that received the book of Galatians. So you have this area, that's just to the west, northwest of, on that coastline, and you're going to see Cilicia, and you're going to see these towns in that area. Now, if you'll notice, this is also, look to the first map, or the map of Paul's first missionary journey, and you'll see this is also the towns that he addressed coming from the other direction. And you're going to see Derbe, and you're going to see the towns that he was in on that first missionary journey. Then he turned and he came back, and he made his way back to Italia, and then he caught that ship and came straight back to Antioch. Now, this is the area to which this decree is going. Now, not like today, he didn't just sit down at his laptop and pound out an email and send it to him and say, here it is. How did this letter make its way there? It went to Antioch, and it went through those regions around Antioch, and then it went by foot as they carried it, and it went to this place, and then it went to this place, and it went to this place. And so this is going to take a considerable period of time for this news to do what? Spread. Okay? Now, they made this trip. So then in verse 24, since we have heard that some who went out from us have troubled you with words, unsettling your soul, saying, you must be circumcised and keep the law. Yes, Ben?
Watching Believe the Bible, where he talked about circumcision was supposed to be on the 8th day because that's the best allotted time for your entire life.
Right.
Like you were saying, if you go back to Genesis 35, we're, no, going back to Genesis 5, with Moses, calling Moses there.
Exodus 5.
Exodus 5.
Yeah.
Okay, you get in verse 24, 5. And Zipporah took a sharp knife or sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at his feet, and said, surely a bloody husband brought down to me. So he let him go, and then she said, bloody husband thou art, because of circumcision. Okay. That kid was older than 8 days. It was a big deal for a grown man to be circumcised. And the Jews threw it out pretty flippantly. They had no choice in circumcision. The parents done that for them.
Right.
And I think sometimes we throw out stuff as flippant as that in our conversation with people. We really don't look at it wouldn't happen to happen.
Right.
Because they had to go to the clock on the 8th day. A grown person did, but yet they weren't providing it only. And so, looking back at Moses, you can see the difference.
Right. And Ben brings up a very serious question. If you're a grown man going through this, and I knew of one young man in particular growing up, and if he got cut, the slightest cut, I mean, it was a major deal because he was a free what? A free bleeder. I mean, just the most minute scratch where the skin was broken and he started bleeding. We would tell one of our kids to what? Wipe it off and go on. Wipe it off and go on. Not him. I mean, if he just fell and skinned his knee, it was a major deal. Well, think about this, because I don't know that they had the ability to identify free bleeders back in the first century. But I mean, this is a very serious situation when you start thinking about it and looking at it in a medical standpoint. And now they're wanting to bind this upon them. Now, Ben has brought up a valid point, because how did the Jews, if you were a Jewish male or woman, and when you were born into what? A relationship with God as a Jew. Now, on the 8th day, the males were circumcised, and that circumcision was a sign of what? Their relationship with God. So now what the what the Jews were saying to the Gentiles was, you could not and cannot be in a relationship with God unless you are what? Circumcised. Now, this is something that to us in this day and time, like I stated earlier, it doesn't carry the same significance that it would in their day and time. But this is a major situation in the first century world. All right, Ben. Hmm. Right. Yep.
Oh man, these Gentiles, God didn't leave these people by themselves. They were under the law also.
Oh yeah, yeah.
We don't agree with that. I know, and you hold on about that.
Right.
You know, so, as to their dealings and their religious behaviors and such. And we know that a lot of them, idol worshipers.
Right.
That was some of the Jews were too.
Right.
They went to do. So we get the feeling, I think, as we study the New Testament, that the Gentiles were just
Abandoned.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
They wasn't.
No.
They were under the law of their own.
That is very, very true. And what law were they under? We need to keep this in our minds when we get to the book of Genesis. What God is dealing with whom? It's what the Hebrew writer talks about in Hebrews 1. God dealt with the fathers, various ways, various manners. We call that the blank law. What is it? The patriarchal law. Okay, so we had the patriarchal law. Then at a particular point in time, God chose to start narrowing things. That started with the call of whom? Abraham. But it's going to work itself out over literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years till finally we find where Moses now finds himself standing where? In Exodus chapter 20. Up on the mountain. And he gets the Ten Commandment law. Now, what's interesting is when that chapter opens for us, God tells specifically who that law is for. It was for the nation that had been in bondage to Egypt. Now, those people coming out of Egypt, they had the Mosaical law. But what was still running concurrent up here? The patriarchal law. That patriarchal law continued. So if you were a non-Jew, you had never been carried off to Egyptian captivity. What law did you follow? Let me put it this way. What law did you have to follow? The patriarchal law. Now you could, by choice, choose to become what? A Jew. And if you made that choice, then you had to do what? Be circumcised. You had to go through everything that pertained to Judaism. Now, this is where the Cornelius event comes in. What had Cornelius been doing for all these years? He was an almsgiver. He was one that was praying to God always. What law apparently was Cornelius under? What was he observing? Patriarchal law. Now, when the gospel came to him, now just like the Jew and every other Gentile, now Cornelius has to make a decision. What am I going to do? Well, he obeyed the gospel. This is where Ephesians 2 comes in. God took up two and made them into one through what? The blood of Christ. So the patriarchal law ended. And we stress this all the time, that the Mosaical law for I don't know how to say this, because in a practical sense, it really ended in AD 70. But in God's mind, it was ended where? At the cross. He took it out of the way. But now, like I stated, it's going to take years and years and years for a lot of this message to get throughout the world. So you're on the backside of the world over there somewhere as a practicing Jew, and you're following the law as you know it, and then 35 years after the cross, what happens? Somebody comes to your town and says, "Hey, have you ever heard about Jesus?" No, I've not heard about Jesus. Well, let me tell you about him. And then you realize then what's happened to the law at the cross. It was taken out of the way. Yeah, Dale.
You know, to reach everybody, that's the reason Paul in the next chapter circumcised Timothy, because he was carrying him into
Jewish territory. Yeah. And didn't want a stumbling block. So this idea of circumcision, to us, it's something like we stated again and again. It's a minor thing to us, but for them, it was a huge hurdle. Sheb?
Okay, you said you could put 35 minutes of the example of good for somebody way off, or two way off. But did they have to go back to Jerusalem every year to worship? One time?
Well, the Jews, the leaders of the Jews, they come up with a rule in their observance of the law that if you were within 90 days of Jerusalem, you had to go back for one of the feast days. But folks, what had they been doing all during Babylonian captivity? Worshiping God in Babylon, Assyria, wherever they were scattered. So by the time they came back out of captivity, the going back to the law or back to Jerusalem for the big feast days, that had started to dwindle. Now, whether it should have or not, that's another point. But that's what had taken place. So therefore, by the time we get to the day of Pentecost, Now, you just think of the practicality of this. You know, we think it's difficult to have to come to worship on the first day of the week, every week, and to not miss the assembly. But just think if you were a Jew and you were to be in Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost, or the Passover, I should say. Let's work this out. For the Passover. So you show up for the Passover, and let's say you live 1,500 miles from Jerusalem, and you come for the Passover. Well, what? Just a few days later, Pentecost. When the day of Pentecost was fully come. So now, are you going to travel 1,500 miles? Go home and then come back? They stayed. That's why when the day of Pentecost comes, we find what? Jews from all over. You read Acts chapter 2, and there's going to be about 11 different nationalities that are there, different folks from different places, and they're there for the day of Pentecost because they'd been there for the Passover. And so they're going to be there, and so they're going to stay, and then they have the Feast of Booths where they were taught. So that's another celebration that was to be observed. Well, in a real sense, there would be months and months that these people would be in Jerusalem and wouldn't be home. Now, when we say Jews, what kind of comes to our mind when we say Jews? For instance, I'm going to Jew you down. What do we mean by that phrase? What do we understand by that phrase, perhaps? Okay, I'm going to negotiate you down. Where did that term ever come to? How did we get that? Okay. So we understand the fact that the Jews were barterers and they were negotiators and all of that. Well, it's not very likely that they're going to come 1,500 miles and be here for Passover and then hot put it back home, take care of their business and hot put it back. That's an impossible trip to even make because they're going to be on foot. It's going to be in very dangerous, very rough terrain. It's going to take them months to travel 1,500 miles. If you were going, if you were clocking 20 miles a day, how many days would that take you? Seven to 15 days. You wouldn't get home until you had to turn around and come right back. Well, yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of things that came into play on this. But one thing they could bind was what? Circumcision. They may not observe the feast days. They may not be making the treks back to Jerusalem like they're supposed to. They may not be doing a host of other things, but they would put their finger down where? If you want to be a Gentile and you want to come to God, you've got to do what? Be circumcised. Ian? Right. Right. And can you not see the practical aspect of this? Why did Jesus drive those people out of the temple? He did it on two occasions, start of his ministry, the end of his ministry. Why did he drive the money changers out of the temple? What were they doing? Doing what? Okay, they were gaining money. But let's say you're one of those Jews and you've traveled 1,000 miles to get to Jerusalem. Are you going to drag your animal with you all the way? No, think about this from a very practical standpoint where you had people to show up in Jerusalem. And so a guy says, I've got an animal for you. Because when they came, they were required to do what? Offer sacrifice. So when you got there, then you didn't want to drag that animal with you all this way. So you showed up, and now here you are, and you need an animal to offer as a sacrifice. How do you think that started out? Can you not envision how this started out? Here somebody comes strolling in the main street, down Main Street of Jerusalem. And they're going, and then, perhaps they stop and they talk to a kinsman. And maybe they even left home with an animal. You think that animal might have died on the road, on the journey? And so they get to Jerusalem, and now they're bemoaning the fact that they don't have an animal to offer as a sacrifice. They've lost it on the way or whatever. And so somebody says, I got one for you. And so they may have either given it to them or sold it to them at a proper price. And these people took it and offered it. And then somebody else observed this. And what does that turn into? As a lucrative business. Huh? So it was a big business, and Jesus dealt with that. And so this is the activities that were taking place around the temple. They had turned God's house of prayer into a den of thieves. Now,
you think that they probably might have had a few really nice animals that were without blemish, but over here we got the runts, the ones that nobody else wanted.
yeah.
You can buy them too.
Well, so when you start thinking about this from a practical standpoint and, just how could this have played itself out, then we can see where this could have started out as a very sincere motive on someone's part, but yet it turned into something that was absolutely horrible. Let's say, like the Corps mentioned, you get to Jerusalem and you don't have an animal to sacrifice for whatever reason, and somebody says, I've got one. And it would have met all the qualifications. It was unblemished. It would have met all of the qualifications for a sacrifice. And I've got one for you here. You take it and go worship. You go offer it. It might have even been given for free. But then that turned into the improper practice that we know Jesus dealt with. But notice now, back to verse 24, he says, since we have heard, we're in Acts chapter 15, that some who went out from us have troubled you with words, unsettling your souls. W.E. Vine, in his work on Greek words, he says, gives this interpretation of this word, unsettling. They were bankrupting. They were bankrupting your soul, saying you must be circumcised and keep the law. Now notice this. The leaders from Jerusalem said, we gave no such what? Commandment. We never told them to do this. Now, when you go back to the early part of Acts 15, when those individuals arrived, they were using the fact that they were from Jerusalem as an authoritative statement and saying, you've got to be circumcised. Well, now we get this correction. No, we never gave this commandment. Now notice he says, it seemed good to us, verse 25, being assembled with one accord, to send chosen men to you with our beloved Barnabas and Paul. men who have risked their lives for the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. We have therefore sent Judas and Silas, who will also report the same things by the word of mouth. For it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us. Now, notice this idea here. It's very easy to just fly by this. It seemed good to whom? The Holy Spirit. These actions and these things that they had decided, this letter that they said, we're going to send this unto you and we're only going to require that you do what? What three things? What three things? They're to abstain from what? Being strangled. What else? Blood, sexual immorality. These things we're going to bind on you. You abstain from those things. And yet this was all under the direction of whom?
Spirit, because these men were guided, these men were filled with the Holy Spirit, they were capable of performing miracles. So
Right.
guided in a sense, maybe a little different than we are today.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. But this was an instruction that had whose approval? God's approval. So now we're going to do this, and we're going to lay upon you no greater burden than the necessary things. If you go back to verses 19 and 20 of this particular section, you'll see that, therefore I judge that we should not trouble those from among the Gentiles, only that they are abstaining from things polluted by idols, sexual immorality, things strangling from blood. These are the things they were requiring of the Gentiles. Well, if you go back and you look, these are things that God had invoked long before Moses and the law of Moses had ever even come into play. Now, notice these things that we're having you to abstain from. These things are listed again in verse 29. Now, notice he says, if you keep yourselves from these, you will do well. Farewell. This is it. This is the letter that was sent to the church at Antioch. And then, as we stated earlier, it made its way through Cilicia and on through that area that Paul traveled on the first missionary journey. Now, we're going to see, beginning in verse number 30, so when they were sent off, they came to Antioch, and when they had gathered the multitude together, they delivered the letter. When they had read it, they rejoiced over its encouragement. Literally means they burst into joy. Okay? They burst into joy. Now, Judas and Silas, themselves being prophets also exhorted and strengthened the brethren with many words. And after they had stayed there for a time, they were sent back with greetings from the brethren to the apostles. What did we read about Judas and Silas on this occasion? They themselves were prophets. How did they get this? By the hands of the apostles. These were inspired men, and these men, Judas and now Silas, had the ability to what? Prophesy. They were prophets. And now they were there, and they used that ability to exhort and strengthen the brethren. And after they had stayed there for a time, they were sent back with greetings from the brethren to the apostles. So they were there for a while. While there, they were strengthening and encouraging the church there in Antioch, and then they sent them back to Jerusalem, and they sent them back with greetings. Verse 34, however, it seemed good to Silas to remain there. Paul and Barnabas also remained in Antioch, teaching and preaching the word of the Lord with many others also. So, Silas is going to become One of these foremost characters as we continue to go through the New Testament. Any of y'all ever heard of Paul and Silas? Well, here's our introduction to him, and he was a prominent character where? In the church in Jerusalem. Now, verse 36, Acts chapter 15. Then after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us now go back and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord and see how they are doing." Now, as we think about this, we mentioned it perhaps earlier as we were talking about Paul and Barnabas, that first missionary journey. They take off, and we've tracked that out, how they went through the island of Cyprus, and then they crossed and they went up, and they went to the cities of Talia and Perga, and then from Perga, then they started moving their way eastwardly, and they went to various places, and we're going to eventually wind up in Acts 14, where Paul is going to be stoned in Lystra, and then all these events unfolded that we talked about, and then Paul and Barnabas made their trek back through those cities, but then they didn't drop down into the island of Cyprus. They just caught a ship and went straight back to Antioch. Why did Paul and Barnabas make that trek back on that first missionary journey? What was the purpose of going back through those cities where they had been so horribly treated? When you go and you look at the Great Commission, in Matthew 28:18, Jesus says, "Go into all the world," or he says in verse Matthew 28:18, "All authority has been given unto me in heaven and on earth. Go ye therefore and make disciples. Baptize them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit." But you baptize them, and then you what? Teach them. So you make disciples, you teach them, you baptize them, then you teach them. So now as Paul and Barnabas are on that first journey, they come through those cities, and you can track them out. And then they turn and they come right back through those same cities, because there was an aspect of the Great Commission they had to fulfill. And what was it? Teaching. They had to teach those folks. Same thing here. Why are Paul and Barnabas, particularly Paul, it seems to be, as he's the one that's mentioned, why now does he want to go back to those cities that they had went to see how the brethren are doing? See how they're doing. He wanted to see, he wanted to know. It's much like we would find Paul as he's talking about all the things that he suffered for the cause of Christ in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, all the physical things. Then you get to the end of that section, and what does he say? "But daily there was laid upon me the care for the churches." Paul said, "I've suffered all of this." You go to Galatians as well, and Paul says, "I bear in my body, I bear branded in my body the marks of Jesus." He could point to this scar, and he could point to this one, and point to this one, and he'd say, "This is what happened to me when I was at Lystra, or this is what happened to me when I was at various places." He would say, "This is where I experienced all of this," and he could point to it. But he wanted to go back through those cities and encourage and strengthen the brethren, because he understood there would be a great need. Now, Barnabas was determined to take with them John called Mark. What had happened? John Mark had what? Abandoned them, deserted them earlier. And so now Barnabas wanted to take him. But now when you look, Paul insisted that they should not take with them one who had departed from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. Then the contention became so sharp between the two that they parted from one another. Barnabas took Mark, sailed to Cyprus. Now, that's the island that earlier, remember, Paul and Barnabas had gone through Cyprus, and what did we read there? Nothing. But Mark and Barnabas went back to Cyprus. Now, notice, and now Paul is going to choose Silas. Here he comes, Silas. Chose Silas and departed, being commended by the brethren to the grace of God. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches, going right back up into that area where he'd been previously. And now Paul or Barnabas and John Mark, they went through the island of Cyprus. Now, what happened in this contention, this discussion? And it was more than that. Did things get heated between Paul and Barnabas? Yeah, they did. And both Paul and Barnabas continued to think and to press the views that they held. And they presented these. And it got rather contentious between them. And sadly, it split up Paul and Barnabas. But in God's providence, what did it do? Doubled the workforce. Now, the sad part is Paul's going to say later, John Mark is now useful to me. And he wants John Mark to come to him, and that would be 2 Timothy chapter 4 in verse 11. Whether it was John Mark's maturity, whatever the case might be, John Mark is one that says he's now useful and beneficial. Yeah, Dale?
Those that had received from the apostles the Holy Spirit in the sense where they could teach and they could teach these people also, because without the word, the written word, how much, if you stayed there 6 months, how much did you teach them, or a month, or whatever? So it was necessary to come back, but there were still, I would think, some that had the ability to receive and the word.
Oh yeah, there's that miraculous aspect that was available during this period of time. And, we could say, y'all be sure to read the book of John this week. But what do you have in your disposal? Book of John. They didn't have that. Took a long, yeah. And even for them to be gathered up in the whole process of where we came to the books that comprise our New Testament. That was years in the future. But what we find here is the division of Paul and Barnabas, and as far as the inspired record, the New Testament records for us, Paul and Barnabas never saw each other again. There's no record that they ever did. So we don't know that for certain. They could have, but not according to what the New Testament teaches us. All right, thank you, everyone. We'll pick up in Acts 16.